Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, folks, for learning with us as we manage new technology for sharing ideas. And again, um, as we get started, when we think about re-engagement from isolation, the pandemic, to getting ourselves connected in the community, I want to really hearken to my dad. And my dad really was my introduction to Parkinson's, although I had been a disability advocate my entire career, growing up in a big Italian family with a cousin that had Down syndrome who was same age as me, and we were close. And it was through my cousin Carrie that I really became a disability advocate. But I really didn't know much about Parkinson's until my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and then it really became real. And one of the things that that we experienced as a family was almost our own little pandemic, right? Because when Dad's diagnosis unfolded, he, was grieving. He didn't know what to expect. He was depressed, and so we basically, sort of rallied the troops and just kind of hung out with Dad. And what we lost in that period of time when Dad began to retreat was his social capital, his relationships. And when you think about this idea, the theme of our conference today, which is from isolation to engagement, that really means going from being by yourself to being with people who you can connect with, who you can relate with, right? We call that social capital. And so at the very core of the idea of engagement, either for the first time or re-engagement, is to really think about our relationships. Because social capital, our relationships, are so fundamentally important to a better life for all of us. Because it's our relationships that are really at the core of keeping us healthy and happy and helping us achieve and advance and feel better about ourselves as people. Even our life expectancy is tied to our social capital. So thinking about our relationships, thinking about the connectedness that we have, and when we now go from an isolated pandemic oriented quarantine back into the community, it really means re-engaging with our social capital. Now, social capital has some key concepts to them, and I don't want to get too academic, but to really understand it, we need to appreciate the fact that the philosophy behind social capital is a philosophy of interdependence, not independence, but interdependence, and recognizing that it's not just about the things we do well, but it's about the people that are in our lives that help us do better. The other key concept, as you can see from the slide, is social influence theory. Now, social influence theory is really important, I think, for all of us that are interested in advocates related to Parkinson's, because social influence theory means how we influence those people in our social capital networks. My relationship with my dad influenced me to understand more about Parkinson's. My relationship with my cousin Carol influenced me to think more about Down syndrome and to think more about intellectual disabilities. And so social influence theory is a critical ingredient. And then the last key concept is what we call value image juxtaposition. It's a big word. Don't get thrown by it. All it means is when somebody is valued in their community and they're side by side someone who is different, maybe experiencing Parkinson's, like with my dad and his tremors and some of the facial freezing that Dad went through. But when Dad was with people who were valued in community, his value increased. Let me share a little bit more about social capital as it relates to not only values, but levels of social capital. We know that through our relationships, we learn things, we grow, we understand more. We have instrumental value, emotional value, and informational value that we get through our relationships. But also, when we begin to think about our relationships, there are three dimensions. And if you're looking at this slide, you'll see it says covenant relationships, activity relationships, and general acquaintanceships. If you think about this like a pie, the general relationships are the outermost ring of that pie. And then when we make new friends, or when we meet up with people and we spend more time with them, that moves us into activities or involvement. And then the most important center of people in our lives are what we call our covenant relationships. These are people that love and trust us. However, when disability unfolds, people, historically lose their social capital. We've been really looking at this, researching it, studying it more closely. And again, my relationship with my dad was really fundamental in my interest in understanding this, because when Dad's Parkinson's was diagnosed and his symptoms began to unfold, Dad really felt self-conscious. He felt, embarrassed, and those kinds of things caused him to back away. In fact, let me share with you that friendship is critical in our world. But when we begin to back away from friendships, and when we focus just on the medical aspects of a disability, these kinds of things take us away from, or they're like a pandemic in and of themselves. I know the families that are online with us today know that when my dad had a string of medical appointments, he was always going to the doctor, the neurologist, or to the urologist, to other doctors, and those appointments, for every minute he was at a doctor's appointment, was 1 minute he wasn't with his social capital. Now, doctor's appointments are important, and I'm not advocating that we reject them, but I think we need to understand that after the diagnosis of Parkinson's, people really become so inundated with the demands for treatment and therapy. They become inundated by the fears that people who knew them and now see them in a different light, how they feel, the embarrassment that they experience. I know with my dad, because of the medicines that he was on, he had to pee all the time. He had to urinate all the time. And he was really embarrassed by that, because a couple times he had accidents, ended up wetting himself. And so all of these things are reasons for people to not engage, right? To keep themselves out of the mix. Yet we know when somebody disconnects from their relationships, bad things can happen. So these kinds of things can create more isolation and more loneliness. And we know that loneliness and isolation are really on the rise in our culture today. In fact, there was a study, it wasn't a Parkinson study, it was a generic study done by Cigna Insurance Company that looked at 20,000 Americans and began to measure how connected are they, how involved are they, or how lonely are they. And they used a survey developed at UCLA called the UCLA Loneliness Scale. And what they discovered is that there was a 10% increase in loneliness in the United States. This was in 2018. In fact, the loneliness issue, however, has become a worldwide phenomenon. Whether or not it's associated with disability is to the side of this conversation, because we know that people, whether they have disabilities or not, can find themselves in lonely situations. In Great Britain, in the UK, the Parliament um, was so concerned about the rise of loneliness in their country that they identified a minister to deal with loneliness, a ministerial level position, reporting to the prime minister, with the sole focus of trying to get people connected, trying to get people more involved, trying to get people more aligned with other people. Because we know when people take themselves out of the mix, they are at risk of loneliness. And when you find yourself in a lonely situation, my goodness, there's biological ripples that unfold there. That actually it's not good for us. Loneliness can make people sick. It can make people their symptoms of their situation can be exacerbated. So the social isolation phenomena is quantifiable. I know if you think about yourself now as you're sitting in your living room or in your den or wherever you're watching this webinar, um, I bet you can feel that you're a bit lonelier today than you were before you had your diagnosis, and that there are some things about your current situation that actually have made you or keep you lonely. Forget the pandemic, forget the coronavirus. Just think about how somebody can become more isolated. Um, so this risk of being isolated and connected goes along with disability. And Robert Putnam, famed Harvard sociologist, said as many people in the United States of America actually die from social isolation as die from all smoke-related diseases and illnesses. So loneliness is something we need to think about, and it's something we can actually do something about. So let's kind of segue and think about what you might consider doing in your situation to get you either reconnected or maybe connected for the first time. Because friendship makes prosperity more shining. It lessens adversity by dividing it and sharing it. This is a quote from Cicero. So how do we build relationships? How do we build connectedness? And how do we go from isolation to engagement, which is the theme of our conference today, right? So the very first thing I think we need to do is identify and stay focused on the things we like to do or the things we care about. Every one of us watching this video, watching this webinar in your living room, you have something you're passionate about, something you care about. For my dad, it was jazz music. My dad was a jazz aficionado, and when his Parkinson's was diagnosed, he wasn't able to play the upright bass anymore. He wasn't able to do the writing and the corresponding work that he did, and he went into a depression. So as a family, we said, how can we use jazz to get dad back in the mix, to get dad connected? So number one, identify something you're passionate about. Number two, find a place in the community where other people gather who like that same thing. For my dad, it was the Pittsburgh Jazz Society. We identified the Jazz Society. We said, let's get dad involved in the Jazz Society. Step three, explore ways and means to stay active with these groups. What kind of compensatory adjustments? Like with my dad, for him to be involved in the Jazz Society really required that we had to make sure that it was accessible. Dad used the wheelchair. We had to make sure the bathroom was accessible where they met. So these were compensatory kinds of issues that we need to think about that makes engagement work, right? What do we need to adjust in the community in order to make it work? Like what's happening with the pandemic today. Now, as we go into the green phase, we're talking about how can we make going to a restaurant work? How can we make going back to church work, right? Sit in every other pew. The singing is now muted. We're not going to do as much singing because we know that there's projection that happens with it. So those are compensatory strategies to help us deal with the pandemic. The same is true in thinking about your Parkinson's, right? what adjustments do you need to make, or does your family need to make? And again, the foundation here, the Western Pennsylvania Foundation, can really help you think that through, help you explore that a bit. And then recognizing the impact of social influence theory. And this is really, again, I don't want to make this too academic, but social influence theory is so important in changing the attitudes or adjusting the attitudes of the people around us, right? So when we got my dad involved in the Jazz Society, the very first thing that I did was I wanted to meet with the president of the Jazz Society, because I wanted to talk with him about my dad's uniqueness, about his situation, and that when dad came to his first meeting, I wanted the president to not be taken aback, right? And so when I talked to the president about Parkinson's, about my dad's tremors, about some of his reality, the president of the Jazz Society was, hey, that's cool, man. He's a jazz man. It's okay if he shakes. It's okay if he can't do some of the things that he did before. He's a jazz man, and we accept him for that. So when the president of the Jazz Society introduced my dad to some of the other members, the president's value in that community led way to my dad's value. This idea of gatekeepers is a critical ingredient to re-engagement in community. Who are the gatekeepers in the places you want to go? And so friendship is like jazz. I've been using a jazz metaphor. It's tough to define, but you know it when you have it. You know who your friends are. You also know who your friends that abandon you are, right? And some people have abandoned you. That doesn't mean that there's not a cadre of people out there who, in fact, will embrace you. And that's the kind of positive spirit that we have to have as we go into it, because there's really no failure except in no longer trying. If we decide we're just going to sit in our home, or in our den, in our living room, and just give up on the world, then that is throwing the towel in, ladies and gentlemen. It's the notion of life is about leading life. It's about living life, and it's about being with other people in life. And so let me finish up with a quote from Albert Schweitzer. That's a wonderful quote. I love this because it reminds me of an experience I had with my dad toward the end of his life, when a couple weeks before he passed away. I was actually helping him with some personal care. I was giving him a bath, and we were in the bathroom, and I was helping my dad get washed, and my dad started to cry, and I was really taken aback by this. I really never, I saw my dad cry, but usually when dad would cry, it was a happy sign. Somebody got a raise, a new baby was going to join the family. But these were different tears. And so I probed and I said, Dad, what's the matter? What's wrong? And he said, I didn't want this for you. And I said, why? What do you mean? He said, I didn't want you to have to take care of me, to have to do these things for me. I should be doing these for myself. I shouldn't have to have you do these for me. And I paused for a moment and I thought, Dad, I'm honored to do this. This is not an imposition. I love you. And then he paused a minute. He cried some more and he said, I don't want you to remember me like this. And it really, at that moment, washed over me this notion that what my dad wanted was basically to know where he stood, right? Where he stood in life. And it gave me a chance right there, right then in the bathroom to tell my dad how much I loved him, how much he meant to me. He's been gone 14, 15 years now, and he's still with me every day. That's the impact of the relationships that we have in our lives. And so as you think about re-engagement from the pandemic, you gotta get yourself back in the mix. Your family can help you. Folks from the foundation can help. There's a whole variety of kinds of things that we can do, because some of the action steps we want to leave you with is we want you to sustain, maintain, and maybe even build new relationships. Sustain the relationships you have, build new relationships, but mostly recognize and celebrate the impact and influence we have with others. Are there downsides to Parkinson's? Of course there are. But are there upsides to life? Yes. And those upsides to life are found through relationships. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be here with you today, albeit virtual. I'm looking forward to when we're able to re-engage face-to-face. My dear friends and colleagues here at the foundation and the amazing work that they do, I'm just so honored to be a part of that. I have some information up on the PowerPoint. You should be able to see this. If you get a minute, you might want to go to my website, which is the last bullet listed on this slide. It's just my name, alcondeluci.com. But on my website, you'll find some videos about social capital. You'll find my TED Talk on social capital. You'll find some articles from books I've written about this. Think about relationships. Go out there and stay connected, because that's really what's going to make life worth living. Thanks so much for this opportunity, David. Christina, thank you so much for having me. And good luck with the rest of the conference. You have some fantastic people who are going to follow me with some great information. Thanks so much. God bless.
Thank you so much for being with us, Al. Every time I ask Al to help out, he says yes. And not only does he say yes to us, but he says yes to the organizations all over the world. We love and appreciate him so much.